Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Knull. He is one of the characters that has been hyped up and anticipated for nearly a year, ever since that poll came out with all the characters that would be upgraded, and we finally got him at the end of the year, or I guess pretty much almost at the very final update before this year has ended. With Doom and Apocalypse both getting upgrades this year and not really meeting players' expectations for natives' cost versus the value that they provided, there was a legitimate worry that Knull would also fall into this category and largely just be very expensive but not really worth that cost or value in terms of his performance in either PvE or PvP or possibly even both. But I can tell you easily that Knull is definitely not in that group, at least on the PvP side. In PvE, he is good, but he isn't really kind of exceptional. He is similar to Sentry, that he is meant to be built for PvP, and my god, his performance in PvP is just unmatchable right now. A lot of people were hoping that Knull's upgrade would at least make him on par with Sentry in PvP so that we could have another counter versus him and the field could be evened a little bit, but as it stands currently, it seems that Knull is on his own level in PvP, considering that he can pretty much invalidate the entire meta by himself without even necessarily needing any kind of maxed out build or any kind of support really. And the gap from him to the next closest meta seems to be pretty sizable, since even Sentry doesn't really put up a massive fight versus him. In some cases he can counter him, but Knull just is clearly better than Sentry in PvP and better than the rest of the roster currently. Although I'm definitely happy that we got a strong upgrade for a native character, especially a native tier 3 character, I'm not entirely sure whether Knull is balanced for PvP currently. He seems just incredibly powerful and way more powerful than the rest of the characters in PvP, almost kind of invalidating those characters and just making PvP kind of black and white. Whether you have Knull or you don't determines whether you win or you lose. And it seems like the best counter to Knull currently is Knull himself. Regardless, I'll run through some potential strats that you can use to take him down in timeline, whether you have him or not, and some potential combos or teams that you can use in Alliance Conquest to beat him, or at the very least take out one of his lives and then do the same with the other team, effectively beating that fight. In typical fashion, when a character this powerful comes out, I had to max them out to fully test their potential, for science of course. So I got him to a rank 5. I previously had him at rank 3, but that was at level 70. When I got him to tier 4, I managed to get him to a rank 5. I currently don't have his artifact though. I'm kind of holding out that we get it for free, so that is one piece that I'm missing and will make the character potentially even stronger. In terms of the build, I'm currently running a brilliant CTP of Conquest, though I did test out different CTPs throughout this video, and I'll mention what those are in the particular clips. I also have pretty much everything else maxed out. I don't have the kind of glory or brilliant Odins, or whatever they're called. I only have the mighty versions of those. I'm not really sure what those are called either. But everything else besides those is completely maxed out. As usual, the first test that I did with Knull is to fight himself in World Boss Legend Knull. On stage 39, I didn't use a leadership or his leadership or any other supports, and was able to complete stage 39 without a damage proc with roughly around a minute remaining, which kind of suggests that the character is at least good for PvE or World Boss Legend specifically. If you want to build him just all around for PvE, then a CTP of Rage will probably be your best option if you want to consider using him in things like ABX and ABL, even though he isn't really a top option there. The CTP of Rage will essentially be the most ideal option for PvE, since you have to delay cancel the 6th skill and will kind of mess up your rotation if you try to run a CTP of Energy or a CTP of Destruction. You can potentially try to make an energy or destruction work, but it will be a little bit tricky because you have to delay cancel the 6th skill, and because the tier 4 also deals damage, it might mess up your proc on the skill that you want. The rotation that I tested for Knull is to do a 1 delay cancel after about a second. This will add some extra hits to your main rotation, which is 3 cancel 4 cancel 5. Once you finish the 5th skill, you can go into the 2nd skill and then repeat that same rotation I mentioned right before this. When you have your ultimate skill, you open with that and delay cancel it after he kind of tears open the portal, and do your same rotation of 3 cancel 4 cancel 5. When you have your tier 4 skill, you basically just kind of weave that in at any point when you have it, because you want to keep spamming it considering that it does so much burst damage just by itself. So you saw from that previous clip that by getting the character to level 80, it improved his clear time by around 2 minutes and 20 seconds on stage 39. So I also went to stage 79 to get a better idea of how much the tier 4 would improve his clear time, considering that the other stages were too low. Just to make sure that that result is consistent, I also went into a stage 39 of Kang, this time using his leadership and 2 supports, and was able to clear the first phase with around 2 minutes and 10 seconds remaining. You don't really need to rush to get Knull to tier 4 currently. He does quite well at level 80 and surprisingly enough even at level 70 versus pretty much the entire PvP roster. The main benefit of getting him to tier 4 is that he'll become more consistent versus these characters, but will more importantly allow you to better counter any opponent Knulls in any kind of mirror matches. Although Knull does get a good stat increase with his tier 4, his physical attack increases by roughly around 12,000 and HP by a little over 25,000, the main value from the tier 4 will be the skill itself. It provides a massive amount of burst damage from the base part of the skill, but also with the striker skill attached on top of that. So when he activates it in PvP, it will almost always one-shot the opponent. Besides that, the skill also provides him with additional healing and also increases his attack following the tier 4, meaning that he'll not only deal more damage following it, but will also be harder to take down. Naturally, a native tier 3 upgraded to a tier 4 isn't cheap. These are the resources I had before I tier 4'd the character, and these are what I had afterwards. I pretty much ended up using roughly around 10,000 carbonadium and close to 8,000 Soul of the Faltine, which is actually pretty good, I think, from what I've seen. If you can tier 4 a native tier 3 character with around 10,000 carbonadium, you're doing well. Usually it takes anywhere from 10 to 12,000 to tier 4 the characters. If you get it under this, then you've done really well. If you get it over this, then you got some pretty bad RNG. For his strikers in PvE, I don't really think there are many good ones that have the same instinct type as him, so you're better off just kind of getting the lower level tier 4 skill and getting the better striker, which will more than likely be ones like Ghost Rider, Thor, Black Widow with a proc, ones like those. On the PvP side, again, there aren't really that many great strikers that match his instinct type, so again, you're better off just using ones that are solid for PvP, which is usually the ones that have iframe ignore, penetration, and a damage proc on them. So that would be ones like Black Widow, for example, Spider-Man, Ghost Rider, Wolverine, and now with the new uniform, Carnage is actually one of the top options for PvP too. From what I found, he basically just one-shots opponents when the striker skill activates on any character. On stage 79 of Knull with that tier 4 upgrade, I was able to clear this about a minute and 30 seconds faster than before. Similarly, on the Kang stage, I was able to clear the first phase about a minute and 30 seconds faster too. Even without a damage proc, I was able to clear this stage and did so with a minute remaining, which suggests that he is usable for some of the higher stages of World Boss Legend if you build him that way, but there still are better options than him for these same kind of restrictions. I believe that the Thanos uniform or the Farmer one still performs better than this, and that isn't even part of a team-up collection. Although Knull is only missing Shock and Burn for ABX and ABL, he doesn't seem to be a top contender for this mode. The number of hits that he has doesn't really come up to par with some of the top performers in these restrictions. However, if you do want to use him, he seems to be okay at the very least, but isn't really anything too special in these modes. Without a damage proc, I was able to score somewhere around 10 million at level 70. Then when I got him to tier 4, I was able to score close to 13 million with him. But keep in mind that other characters like Wolverine, for example, was able to score 14 million with him, and characters like Hulk, I was able to score 15 million in ABX, both of those characters without a damage proc. So that means that for ABX, at least he's not really going to be used. And then for ABL, I think that Loki still is better than him, even though he is frustrating to play for a lot of the top players. When I tested him in ABL, I ended up switching to a mighty CTP of Rage, but even with that and a high team-up collection having the additional 5% Pierce, I was still only able to hit around 10 million and didn't really come close to hitting 12 million. I think one of the issues with him in ABL is that when you get that full Odin Force meter, you can't really stack on all of your skills all at once because you have to delay cancel the tier 3 skill, and that eats up a lot of time and takes off a lot of hits if you decide to cancel it. For this reason, I still think that Loki is the best option, followed by Thanos probably after that. With the first character to have immortality and the effect built into his kit, it's no surprise that Knull is an absolute monster in PvP. Before I tier 4'd him, I decided to test him at level 70, which I didn't include in this because the video would get too long, but even at level 70 I was able to beat all of the opponents that I faced that weren't mirror matches. I decided to showcase what he could do at level 80, which most players should be able to reach if they can't get him to tier 4, and I only tested with just HP supports on my team while facing off versus fully built brilliant CTP characters that had Colossus support. Keep in mind that my build is only a mighty CTP of regen. I didn't really use anything fancy here at all. Knull's kit is stacked for PvP. Not only does he have that immortality passive, but he is also a universal type, meaning that he doesn't have a type disadvantage. He has 40% damage reduction. He has a self debuff removal, meaning that you don't need a self debuff leadership or a passive. You can pretty much run him however you like with any kind of team. He has 40% healing on the second skill, which increases further with recovery rate, and he can spam that every 4 seconds because the skill is on such a low cooldown. On top of that, he also has 4 seconds of invincible on that skill and removes all debuffs. Then when he uses his 5th skill, he gains 5 seconds of debuff immunity. So you basically can't really CC him unless the fight really goes on and there are kind of gaps in those cooldowns. On top of that, the uniform also gives him super armor, so by stacking up the super armor and invincible, he kind of gets a pseudo kind of super guard break immunity effect going. It's also important to note that he has high skill priority on the 2nd and 5th skill, meaning that he'll typically go into those skills before the opponent, and considering that both are full iframe skills, including the 4th skill too, he won't really be able to take damage unless the opponent can also spam iframe ignore skills. Offensively, Knull has super guard break penetration on the 2nd and 5th skill, meaning that he'll be able to lock down or head rock any opponent with the exclusion of ones that have that super guard break immunity built in, like Sentry or Gore for example. And on top of that, his 2nd skill also has that 100% penetration to all sources, meaning that the opponent isn't safe even if they have things like barrier or invincible. Besides this, the 2nd skill also ignores a portion of the opponent's damage reduction. The 4th skill provides him with damage accumulation and damage that lingers on the field and that he can layer on with the other skills, being his 5th skill, which also provides him with 60% attack increase. And considering that he has a self debuff removal passive, you can also utilize his leadership, which provides symbiotes with a 60 attack increase, including himself. And the uniform also provides him with guaranteed crit, meaning that all of his skills will hit harder. Also, for those wondering whether he has super guard break immunity built in like Sentry and Gore, the answer is that he doesn't. You can clearly see in this video that he was head rocked by Sentry's 2nd skill, and even after I took out Jean, you'll see that the lingering 5th skill kept him locked into position afterwards. So he clearly doesn't have super guard break immunity built in, but like I mentioned before, because he can constantly spam the 2nd skill and refresh his invincible effect, as well as remove any kind of CC effects or debuffs, he effectively gains a kind of super guard break immunity effect in his kit, meaning that you can utilize some CTPs that don't really have guard break immunity or the super guard break immunity effect as the top proc. When I got the character to tier 4, there wasn't really too much to test because he was already beating everything at level 80. I ended up switching to a mighty CTP of Conquest just for those tests, but eventually went to a brilliant CTP of Conquest when I used him in Alliance Conquest and Otherworld Battle. In terms of the build options that I can recommend, when a character is this strong, you can essentially make any kind of build work. You don't even necessarily have to use a CTP or even one for PvE. You could potentially even use an obelisk, and he should be able to perform pretty well versus pretty much everyone in the game, with the exception of any kind of mirror matches versus Knulls who are built for PvP. With that said, I would say that the two top options for Knull are Conquest and Greed. They are, I believe, both equally viable, and it just depends on your preference and how you end up teaming the character and the opponents that you face. If you're going for a tanky build, then a CTP of Conquest is the most ideal one. It provides you with a good balance of offensive capabilities and survival. You are able to leverage the recovery rate from it as well as the wall effect, because the character has some pretty high damage reduction built in, which you can stack even higher with characters like Agent Venom or additional supports. In addition to this, Conquest also provides him with a layer of protection from Reflect. When a character is this strong, oftentimes the opponent will try to counter with Reflect, and he is actually susceptible to it if the opponent has iframe ignore and Reflect like Silver Surfer has, or a few other characters do. So that provides him with protection against that, because if you're using something like CTP of Greed instead, the high burst damage that you have when you hit the opponent will make you take even more Reflect damage. An Authority, Refinement, and Regen doesn't provide you the same value for several reasons. The Authority only really provides you with that steal effect when that's activated. The Invincible doesn't do much, considering that he spams it frequently, and you don't get an added layer of protection from Reflect damage. The Refinement doesn't have guard break immunity, which, although it doesn't matter versus most other characters, it will matter when you're facing off versus Knull. And then Regen doesn't really compare because you don't get super guard break immunity, which again won't matter versus other opponents but will versus Knull. The other reason that I'm testing a Conquest first is because I am using the character on timeline, and oftentimes you don't really need the added offense when you're playing the character manually, considering that you can go through multiple skills at once and stack them up and layer them on top of one another to get the same kind of burst damage that you would typically get if you just use the character on auto with a damage proc, but this might not apply for everyone. On top of that, I'm also using the character in Challenger, and in Challenger, immortality effects don't really work, so I want to keep the character alive as long as possible, because if he dies just once, then I can't really use him again. With that being said, when I faced off versus opponent Knulls that had stacked up supports, it seemed like the CTP of Greed did have an edge. Oftentimes the fights would linger on, and the top proc from the CTP of Greed would activate to ignore the damage reduction for my team, and with the added proc from the CTP of Greed would often trigger the immortality effect on my end first, and then would basically take out the character before I could do the same. That wasn't always the case, as you can see from this clip, but if you are facing off versus opponent Knulls that also have stacked up supports, it seems like the CTP of Greed does have an edge there, and oftentimes will help you out, especially if you've also built your sentry with a CTP of Greed and have a similar build. You're probably doing so because you're facing off versus mirror matches where you need that offensive capability. It very well could be that the CTP of Greed is the more popular option for Knull, because you're more often going to be fighting versus mirror matches where you need that boost, as opposed to not really needing it when you're fighting off versus everyone else. But I wanted to test the Conquest first to see how it would compare to it and the rest of the roster, especially in things like Alliance Conquest and Otherworld Battle. In terms of using the character on manual, he is pretty straightforward to play. You just want to spam and open with the second skill. After that, you typically want to go into the fifth skill, though if you can, try to use the fourth skill very quickly and cancel into the fifth skill. This will give you damage accumulation and potentially lock down the opponent while they're taking a massive amount of damage. But typically you want to use the second skill whenever it's available. The fourth skill is an added bonus because it will also fill up your tier 4 faster, which will give you that burst damage and the iframe ignore from the striker, as well as improving your survivability. If you want some strategies on how to counter Knull in PvP, specifically timeline, This is one of the ones that I found. You open with Sentry and move away from Knull when he does his second skill. You try to move into a corner so you have more of the map available to you. You might end up dying on the first life, but when you revive, or if you didn't end up dying, you immediately go into your second skill to get that iframe ignore, and then follow with the third skill right after so that you lock him down and get additional damage from the buffs on your third skill. You follow that up with the fifth skill to keep him locked down, stay in that skill, and then follow up with the fourth skill. By this time, your skills will have rotated around long enough while Knull is still locked down that you can do it again and not only take out his first life with that immortality activation, but the second one as well. If you end up dying and not taking out the second life, so he comes out of the CC effects, then you just clean up the second life with Silver Surfer, which you typically can do in 1 or 2 lives as well. If you've built up Knull yourself, this becomes a lot easier. You move away with Sentry when he opens, and switch out as soon as you get far enough. Then you immediately just go into your own Knull's rotation of doing the second skill followed by the fourth and fifth, or just the fifth, and you should be able to have activated his immortality effect before they activate yours, allowing you to just continue the fight and get that second activation before them. A much easier strategy I found, especially versus opponents that are using Greed Knull, is just to open with Silver Surfer, move into a corner, Knull will take your first life, and then on the second life you immediately use your fourth skill and cancel that into the third skill. This will activate Knull's first immortality effect, or take out the first life, then wait about a second and you should have kind of the protections from your effects to be able to move away and switch into another character. This will allow you to either take out the second life with that character or die and take out the second life right after. One of the characters that I used for that was Adam Warlock. I ended up dying with the first life of Adam Warlock, but then immediately when I respawn, I can just do a 5 cancel into the 2. Since I have a CTP of Greed proc, I'm able to take out Knull's life pretty quickly, almost immediately, even though they have Agent Venom as a support. You don't necessarily need Adam Warlock to employ this strategy. You can use any other character that can take out another of Knull's lives. So in this particular one, I use Sentry using that combo that I showed previously, but you can use any other character. You can use Wolverine, for example. You can also use your own Knull to do the same thing to take out the second life. It's fairly obvious that the character will be and is meta in Otherworld Battle as well, especially when the buffs favor him, but even when they don't and he has a penalty, he can still be used because he has that crazy lockdown, so he doesn't really need the damage. You can use him just as a kind of utility there. But you also have to keep in mind that because he has self-debuff removal, you can throw him on pretty much any team and not have to worry about the kind of debuff effects on him or not. You can pretty much run him on a zombie team, for example, or even a mutant team with Apocalypse, and he'll have that self-debuff removal anyway. And if you pair him with Agent Venom and characters like Carnage or Silver Surfer, you will have a pretty ridiculous and annoying team to deal with. Funny enough, I recently got a brilliant CTP of Liberation, and it is probably the most ideal build for Agent Venom now because he can function with it, considering he has guard break immunity and provides a ridiculous buff to the rest of the team and can still function by himself. As you see in this clip, I was actually able to finish off Wolverine and even Adam Warlock. If you had any doubts about how ridiculous this character is in PvP and how he is essentially on another level, here is me fighting versus the top meta characters currently in Alliance Conquest, and I'm not even using Agent Venom. I'm using She-Hulk's leadership and Beast to get some extra HP, and he was able to basically run through the first team like nothing and beat the second team as well without much difficulty. I did end up having my health go down to the immortality effect once, but still ended up winning pretty easily. I'm not entirely sure what top metas and combinations can counter Knull in Alliance Conquest currently. It's a little bit difficult to tell. I have to test more, and there isn't really enough time for me to do that before showing this video. But one of the ones that I found had some potential was using Carnage with Agent Venom and one other potentially strong character. I got pretty close with Spider-Man, almost activating the immortal effect for Knull in this first fight. I was able to take out one of Silver Surfer's lives, but it seems that I would probably need another strong team on the bottom here to be able to clean that fight up. Most of the top meta teams in Alliance Conquest that I tested don't really seem to take out both of Knull's lives. They usually activate the immortality effect, but don't live long enough to trigger it again. So you likely will need two of these top teams stacked on the top and bottom to be able to fully beat this character. One of those other potential options is using Wolverine. If you want to take him out in just one team, your most reliable option will more than likely be running your own Knull, though when you do that fight, if you're both equally kind of stacked up, in this one I have the advantage because I have the character to tier 4, but if they were on the same level, you're also going to be at the luck of RNG, so you probably also want a good strong second team to be able to clean up the fight if you do end up failing it. And in a kind of ironic twist, I ended up fighting the two previous native characters that weren't so well received and just going through them instantly. Interestingly enough, the easiest counter that I found versus Knull without running Knull yourself is to use Silver Surfer and Reflect characters. Silver Surfer is the best candidate for this because he has that iframe ignore counter, which will knock Knull out of his skills, and with all the AoE effects on the ground, it will make Knull take all of that damage back as reflect damage, taking out the first life or activating that immortality effect. And if you're running strong metas, you can potentially take him out fully, but if you're not, you just have to run another strong meta team to take out his second life. But surprisingly enough, you can actually use the defenders to take out the second life because Knull will again open with that iframe skill, the second skill, and the defenders have the same kind of effect that Silver Surfer has. They have reflect, they have a high damage reduction, especially from physical damage, which will keep them alive, and characters like Luke Cage will open with his own iframe ignore skill, allowing you to knock Knull out of his skills and make him take all of the damage from his skills as reflect damage back, because he's knocked out of his iframe skill, which he typically wouldn't be taking reflect damage from, but would in this case. Another potential counter character that I didn't show here is Ghost Rider. You can use him either on the first team or the second team, and he will either activate the immortality effect once or be able to take out Knull if the immortality effect has already been triggered, and you typically run him on the second team. To summarize the build options for the character, I would say that Conquest and Greed are the top options, and it will come down to preference a lot of times and depending on how you use the character and in what content. Conquest is great for making him tankier and is largely probably going to be used in things like Timeline Challenger to keep the character alive longer because he only gets one life, and to protect him against reflect characters like Silver Surfer, or as you saw, characters like Luke Cage in things like Alliance Conquest. For players that need more offense or prefer it, or who are facing off versus a lot of mirror matches with Knull being stacked up with supports, a CTP of Greed will likely be the better options there, because the top proc or the ambush effect will allow you to bypass all of those stacked up damage reductions that the opponent won't be able to do, and you should be able to trigger his immortality effect on the opponent's side quicker than they do on your side. But this will need more testing, so I can't really recommend one over the other currently. These are just some kind of potential situations where you might want to use one build over another. If you're interested in PvP whatsoever, I would say that Knull's uniform and building him is essential for the foreseeable future. He is absolutely dominating PvP almost to his own level, where other characters can only take out one of his lives or activate that immortality effect once, and you need combinations of multiple meta teams to take him out fully, unless you use him himself. Although I'm happy that Knull got such a great upgrade, I'm not entirely sure that he's well balanced, considering that he's invalidated pretty much the entire roster for PvP, and any future characters that come out won't be able to really compete in Timeline to the same extent. They have to be basically native tier 3 characters for the most part, and even then they would need to get a pretty massive upgrade to be able to exceed Knull, so you're just going to be invalidating all of the roster again, or at least competing on the same level. You won't really be able to use any other characters for things like Timeline at the very least. They need to start releasing some powerful upgrades for reflect characters to be able to counter some of these insane kits, so that would be upgrades to Emma, Luke Cage, Dormammu, and even characters like Destroyer, who basically have only gotten an awakening but should definitely be much stronger. These reflect characters are always ones that would keep such insane kits and powerful characters in check, and is something that the devs definitely need to consider moving forward. Otherwise, it's just going to be native tier 3 characters dominating Timeline and Alliance Conquest, and you're pretty much just going to be throwing your entire roster at these characters trying to beat them, and is essentially the only ones that you're really going to be facing off versus. That covers all of the testing that I've done for Knull currently, including my fun rant about game balancing. A very powerful character for PvP that is essentially on his own level. The next character that I'll be taking a look at is Carnage. I'm not sure if I'll get to it before the discounts end, but if you're interested in Timeline and Alliance Conquest, Carnage is now potentially in the top 5 for that, so definitely a character to look out for, even though he's slightly overshadowed by the insane performance of Knull. I put a lot of effort into this video and trying to get it out as soon as I can, so if you enjoyed it, found it entertaining or useful, please consider liking, sharing with others, and subscribing. Definitely helps my channel grow and can potentially help others as well if they see this and learn something from it. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.